You've one that's more vivid perhaps than you've ever had, and you're being approached by a strange, powerful creature, strangest that you've ever seen. And you begin to notice strange details about this creature. Your heart's beating faster. You're wondering if he's going to eat you alive or trample you. And you're even shocked even more by the presence of intense evil that you feel. It's as if Satan himself is moving toward you. I imagine down these lines when I think of what the Apostle John must have felt as he was given the visions in Revelation. We have the entire book of Revelation, of course, written by John. It's really Jesus Christ who gave that revelation to John. But in doing so, he saw these visions of these creatures that must have brought an emotional response. When he woke up from that vision, or came back to himself after the vision, he must have had an emotional sensation that must have accompanied it. A vision is much more intense than a dream. It's like you're actually there. And of course, he was being given these visions by God. And it is said that John, of course, he was the last author to write the New Testament and the book of Revelation, and it said that John appeared, tradition has it, church tradition has it, that he appeared before the Roman emperor, and he explained to the king about the kingdom of God, and he didn't like it, so he ordered him to be boiled in a vat of oil. But according to church tradition, that didn't kill him. He was miraculously saved, and so he was exiled to the Isle of Patmos. Now, we know that he was exiled to the Isle of Patmos because he mentions writing the book of Revelation from there and receiving those visions. If you go back to Revelation chapter 13, we're going to start by talking about one of these beasts that he sees, strange vision. Revelation chapter 13. And we'll pick up reading in verse 1, where it says, "I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name." So here's this beast that he's seeing coming up out of the ocean. And of course, I'm sure back in his day, they didn't know as much about the creatures of the sea as we do. He probably imagined this terrible Leviathan thing coming up, and what was it going to do? What was its purpose? Strange vision to see here. Notice he goes on to say, "The beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, his throne, and his authority." And of course, we recognize that dragon being Satan. So he saw with this terrible beast that had parts from other animals, various animals, there's this presence of Satan, of evil there. It goes on, I won't read it yet, we'll read it a little bit later in the sermon, but he goes on to talk about how that the beast one of the heads was mortally wounded, and then it was healed. And the world marveled at this beast. And they followed the beast. It says they worshiped the dragon who gave the authority to the beast. No one could make war with him. And he spoke blasphemies and continued for 42 months. 3.5 years, this beast continued. And it goes on to say that he made war with the saints and overcame them, to overcome them. And to every tribe, it says, an authority was given over every tribe, tongue, and nation. And the earth worshipped him, whose names were not written in the book of life. What kind of beast is this? And if you go down a little further, notice in chapter 13, verse 16, it says that he causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, everyone, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, and that no one may buy and sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. What strange words that is. Now, of course, if you've been in the church any number of years, you've read this a number of times probably, and heard messages, Bible studies, sermons on it. That I would like to address, what is this beast? And what is this mark? And I'm going to take 2 sermons to go through this because it's a longer subject than I'd want to give just in one sermon. But what is this beast? And what is this mark? And why is it that it's important for us to know? Why is it important for us to know? Why do we need to understand this? If you go back to Revelation chapter 1, that question is answered for us. God wants us to be aware of some of the things that likely will happen in the lifetime to some of us here. We simply don't know how far this is into the future or how close it may be. But God wants us to be aware so that we can remain faithful. Revelation chapter 1 and verse 1 says, the revelation of Jesus Christ. Notice it's the revelation of Christ. He's revealing it through John. It says, which God gave him to show his servants things that must shortly take place. God wants us to know what's going to take place. And for at least one generation of us, this would be shortly. And we have thought for many years that this probably isn't too far off. And of course, as we see world events taking place the way they are, we see the stage being set for what Revelation says will happen at the very time of the end, just before Christ's return. But sometimes I look at this word shortly take place. Why did John write that? I think there could be 2 explanations. Because first of all, this would be read by the church in the end of the age. And for us, it is shortly take place. But if you think about it in God's terms, by the time when John wrote this a couple thousand years ago, roughly, this was very close to the very end in terms of the way God sees time, in terms of how old the earth is, how long God has been working on a plan to create the earth, to have everything the way it is, and then man came along very late in the history of the world, you may say. So in God's eyes, it is shortly. But certainly for the generation that sees these things happening, it would be a very short time. We know from other verses that when these things start to happen, it happens very quickly. And God wants us to be aware of what's going to happen so that we can remain faithful. Now, again, what is this beast? This leopard, this feet of a bear. I mean, what does that all symbolize? If we just had Revelation itself, it might be very difficult to come to a good conclusion about what this really meant and what this really was. But when we go back to the book of Daniel, written many years earlier, when we put together some of what Daniel wrote and what God revealed through Daniel, we see that Daniel and Revelation go together quite nicely. In fact, we can interpret much of what we find in Revelation by understanding what Daniel revealed back in Daniel. So if you go back to Daniel chapter 2, we have this famous vision of Nebuchadnezzar. And this really, you've probably read this many times. You've seen the image of the giant person with a head of gold all the way down to the feet of clay and iron. You've probably seen that picture many times. But as we read it today, think about the significance of what is happening here. God is revealing to this Nebuchadnezzar, this king of the great Babylonian Empire, what is going to happen all the way through history. Now, he doesn't get into every detail, but the main details that are going to affect the people of Israel, the people of Judah, the empires that they're going to interact with, it's going to exercise power and control over them. He's giving this pagan emperor an idea of what's going to happen. You talk about in a sense, preaching the gospel. Didn't necessarily go to the world, but it went to the leader of the world, that part of the world at that time. Again, picking up then in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 1, it says, now the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. Again, imagine having these dreams or like visions where you're seeing things that may not in and of themselves be scary, but you're just overwhelmed by what you're seeing. And he must have, to lose sleep over it and to have his spirit so troubled, it must have really impacted him, this vision that God had given to him. And the king gave the command to call all the magicians, astrologers, and sorcerers of the Chaldeans, and to tell the king his dream. So they came and stood before the king. And you know the story. They wanted to know the dream so they could interpret it. He said, "You tell me the dream and what it means." And of course, they informed him that nobody could do that. Nobody could tell him his dream. Of course, it must have kind of surprised Nebuchadnezzar, because these are supposed to be astrologers. These are supposed to be people who can know these things. And in a very real way, it pointed to the fact that only God really knows all these things, and only God knows the future. And at the end of this story, we see that Nebuchadnezzar, imagine how amazed he must have been that Daniel could come up with the answer. Nebuchadnezzar had told no one. How could Daniel know unless it came from the true God? Now, of course, many of these cultures believed in many gods, but none of them could do what Daniel's God did. And of course, Daniel gave the true God credit for it. This had to have a tremendous impression upon Nebuchadnezzar. And you have to wonder how much of an impression this whole experience that he had affected his predecessors. The stories, the legends, if you were, that were passed down. Of course, Daniel records it for us to know what happened. But how was it interpreted by Nebuchadnezzar? What did he tell those who came after him? Because this would have been an amazing revelation to him. Daniel chapter 2, verse 19, we'll pick up there. The secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. So Daniel blessed the God of heaven. And Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding." And so we see here this idea that God is in ultimate control. God allows Satan and his demons to have influence and impact, but only to the degree that God, who ultimately controls everything, allows. And he even removes and raises up kings. And that's what this word kings can be translated kingdoms, as it sometimes is in other places. Let's pick up in verse 31 then. Daniel 2, verse 31. This is Daniel talking to Nebuchadnezzar. He says, "You, O king, were watching." This is how he reveals to him the dream he had. "You were watching, behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome." So Daniel's not only explaining what he saw, but he's explaining some of the awe that Nebuchadnezzar felt as he saw this. He says the image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, and its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron, partly of clay. Again, this image that probably many of you have seen so many times, and most of you are aware that this head of gold, the first empire, pictured Babylon. Babylon was the empire that came in and overtook the Jews and took them captive. And Daniel's writing this as Babylon has taken the Jewish people captive. The next empire that succeeded Babylon was Persia. Medo-Persian Empire, which again exercised control over the Holy Land, the area that God had given Israel, the time that they were there, and allowed them to come back, reestablish their Jerusalem and a nation there. The belly and thighs of bronze representing the Greek Empire, which came and had control over that same area after that. And finally, the legs of iron being the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, which has, as we know, and I won't get into today, but has had various revivals over the course of history, symbolized by another scripture we'll get to in a little bit, but not by those 10 toes, but by 10 kings that we'll read about in just a little bit. Notice, picking up verse 34 then, "You watched while a stone was cut out without hands." Now this is a very important aspect of this, because he's showing how the God of the universe is going to ultimately exercise control. "He watched the stone that was cut out without hands, struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, and broke them to pieces." So it's interesting that here the feet were struck, And this stone, of course, pictures Jesus Christ and his return. And the specific part of the image that was struck was the feet, which symbolize, jumping ahead, those 10 kings or kingdoms which shall give their power to the beast in the end. That's what these toes symbolize. And this stone, representing Christ, hits those feet, those toes, and broke them in pieces. Verse 35, and the iron and clay and bronze and silver and gold were all crushed together and became like chaff of summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, so there was no trace of them to be found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So notice this stone became huge, representing the kingdom of God. But these great kingdoms, representing Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, the mighty, mighty Rome, are no more than chaff that blows away in the wind. What a vision. What an amazing statement that no matter how powerful these nations and kingdoms are, ultimately they're nothing compared to God and what he is establishing. And I'm sure that that when he's told this interpretation, that it's not only is he flattered to be the great head of gold, Nebuchadnezzar, but the end game here, that everything that he built and what comes after him comes collapsing down at a stone that becomes a mountain, so much bigger than the image that he saw. Obviously, this is the concept of the kingdom of God being revealed to Nebuchadnezzar. It's, in essence, the gospel of the kingdom being preached in a very unique way, and in a way that Nebuchadnezzar could not ignore. Daniel's telling him what he saw. Verse 36 says, "This is the dream. Now I will tell you the interpretation of it before the king. You, O king, are the King of Kings." Oh, he probably got big chest at that point. How wonderful it is to be the King of Kings. "For the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory." Now that's a little bit humbling to think that someone else gave it to me. But Daniel's revealing to him that nothing can happen without the God that revealed this dream willing it and making it so, or giving his okay. It says, in picking up just before verse 39, it says, "You are this head of gold," verse 39, "but after you shall arise another kingdom, inferior to yours." And so we know it's a succeeding kingdom. It comes after that. It's inferior to yours. And so what we generally see here is inferior in terms of values. You may say morally inferior, but oftentimes militarily stronger. It says, "Then another, third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron." And of course, we recognize, along with most commentators, by the way, that this would be the Roman Empire, which was in power when John wrote this. "The fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron," and was in power when John wrote Revelation, not Daniel here. It says, "The fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, insomuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, and that kingdom will break into pieces and crush all others." And we certainly realize that the Roman Empire had an army that was the greatest anyone had seen, at least in the Western world. And those who had influence over the Israelites and the Jewish kingdom, this was an amazingly powerful kingdom represented by iron, and of the gold, the bronze, the silver, and iron. The iron is the strongest of them, and again representing that Roman Empire. And going down to picking up in verse 41 then, "Whereas you saw the feet and toes partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided." Now again, we're talking about the toes and the feet here. And what we find prophetically is this part of the prophecy hasn't happened yet. We've had the Babylonian, Medo-Persian, the Greek, and the early Roman Empire, but there's a revival of that Roman Empire that's still yet to come, that's represented by these feet and toes. Notice he says that these feet and toes, partly of potter's clay, partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. "Yet the strength of iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. And the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay. So the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they shall mingle with the seed of men, and they shall not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. So the idea here being that this empire has great strength, you may say military strength, but they don't have a lot of unity. And certainly when we look at the last resurrection of the Roman Empire that will take place in Europe, and we look at Europe today, there's a semblance of unity, of trying to work together, and more authority is being given to the European leaders. But there's still a great amount of independence. The French are still French. Germans are still Germans. The English people wanted out, at least many of them wanted out of it. And so we still see that not adhering to one another, even though we don't see the beast power on the scene yet. We certainly see the stage being set for a power that still is quite divided within themselves. Verse 44, in the days of these kings, represented by those 10 toes, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left for other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and shall stand forever. So what a message to the first king, this great King Nebuchadnezzar. What a message for him to hear that in the final days there will be these 10 toes, ceramic and iron, and this kingdom will be established. Again, what an impression it must have made on Nebuchadnezzar. I'm not saying by any means he was ever converted, but as far as a prophetic message that hit home, more than any of his astrologers and the pagan soothsayers and all that, more than any of them could do, the true God revealed the gospel message of the kingdom to him. Notice verse 45, it says, insomuch as you saw that stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. Again, it's interesting that many, even commentators outside of the church, recognize these empires are associated with these prophecies. Because when you look at history, and without going into all the details of these prophecies, when you look at history, it just fits. God orchestrated it to happen just the way that he says. Now, so we read Daniel 2, and we get kind of an idea of the overarching prophetic history, as it would happen from Daniel's day and Nebuchadnezzar's day all the way to the return of Christ. When we get to John and his writings in Revelation, we see that there's a composite there of what we find not only in Daniel 2, but also in Daniel chapter 7. If you understand Daniel 2 and Daniel 7, you can understand Revelation 13 and other places all the more. Let's go to Daniel chapter 7 then. Daniel chapter 7, and we'll pick up reading in verse 1. Again, the beast that we talked about earlier in Revelation is a composite of the empires represented by the image in Daniel 2, and also what we're about to read of the 4 beasts in Daniel chapter 7. You got to just keep in mind that John would have been very aware of these prophecies in Daniel, and the church at the time would have been very aware of these prophecies. So what John wrote would have built on what Daniel had revealed much earlier. Daniel chapter 7. And the first year of Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions in his head while on his bed. And he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts. And Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up a great sea. And the 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, each in a different order. So this is kind of similar to what John saw. In verse 4, and the first was like a lion, and had eagle's wings. And I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth, and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. And a man's heart was given into it. So we have this beast that looks like a lion. And we recognize, again, this is associated with what Daniel had seen earlier, the golden head in Babylon. represented by this lion in this case. Verse 5, then suddenly another beast, a second, like a bear. And it was raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it, arise, devour much flesh. Again, representing that second kingdom, the Persian Empire, which was known for being desperately cruel. They would go in and kill an entire village, decapitate them, throw all their heads in a pile outside the city, just so the other cities would see the horror of it and surrender to them. They just didn't think anything about killing. It was done very easily, and they were fierce in that way. Tearing people apart, like you might imagine a bear might do. Verse 6. After this I looked, and there was another, like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. And the beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Now this is interesting as a representation of the next kingdom, Greece, because I think we've all heard of Alexander the Great and his tremendously fast trek to take over the world. And he died early. What was it, 30, 33, somewhere in there? Very young he died, and his dominion was handed over to his 4 generals. 4 of his generals took over that entire area that he had very quickly taken militarily. And so we even have here the beast had 4 heads, this leopard that was very fast, took over dominions very quickly, and then had 4 heads, which represents those 4 generals. It's just fascinating how all this actually happened, to the point that many commentators, many critics of the Bible will say that Daniel wrote after all these things, because he prophesied so well that he couldn't have written it before. It just couldn't be. They don't allow for God's inspiration in all that. But certainly he was revealing what God said would happen, and it happened just as he said. Verse 7, and after these things in the night visions, and behold, the 4th beast was dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. Notice he's just called a beast. It's not a lion, it's not a leopard, it's not a bear, it's not anything that he's seen before. Something very unique. It was dreadful, terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth, and it was devouring, breaking into pieces, trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it. And it had 10 horns. So here again, this iron is often associated with the Roman Empire and the strength of the Romans over the ages. And in this case, these 10 horns represent successive kingdoms. Now, that's one of the things that get a little bit confusing, because we have 2 sets of 10. One 10 represents the 10 kings or kingdoms that will exist at the very end, and another 10 represent revivals of the Roman Empire that will come into play. And if you just keep that distinction in mind, it does help understand a little more about these prophecies. And in this case, this was 10 horns, were 10 resurrections or revivals of the Roman Empire. And we'll get more into that a little bit without going into all the details, but there's a great deal of history that is fascinating with that. Notice in verse 15, I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit, within my body, and the visions of my head troubled me. And I came near to the one of those who stood by and asked him the truth of all this. So there's an angel standing nearby. He says, what is the truth of this? And he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. Those great beasts, which are 4 kings, or as the margin says in verse 23, can be translated kingdoms, which would be more accurate in this case. 4 kingdoms which shall arise out of the earth, the people of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever and ever. Amen. I think it's interesting that as we read through these prophecies, there's always an emphasis. He tells us the kingdoms will arise, but always the emphasis is on the fact that they shall be destroyed and the saints, the people of God, shall rule forever. There's always that hope associated with every one of these prophecies. It was the major part of it, because it was the kingdom, the focus on the kingdom that these prophecies had. So in the end, no matter how powerful these political beings and beasts and empires are, And even though they sometimes would persecute Christians and God's people, in the end, God's people win. God wins. And it was always a message of hope in the midst of this power and this terror of these beasts that were being seen. Verse 19, and I wished to know the truth about the fourth beast. Wow, this one's so terrible, I don't even know how to describe it. Tell me about this fourth beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron, its nails of bronze, which devoured, broke in pieces, and trampled the residue with its feet. And then it talks about 10 horns were on its head, and the other horn which came up before it, which 3 fell, namely the horn with the eyes and the mouth which spoke pompous words. Now, I'm reading over that quickly. We'll talk about that next time. This is talking about a religious association and that would be associated with this secular empire. But we'll get to that. Don't worry about that. Verse 21, I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them until the Ancient of Days came, and the judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. So again, the idea of the hope that we have to come. And I think as we see these events, actually the end-time events and some of these prophecies being fulfilled, it's going to be so important to read the last part of the prophecy. Sometimes we get caught up in, who is the beast? Who is the beast power? And all that's it's natural to be curious and want to know how these things, the details of these things. But the most important thing is that God establishes His kingdom. And these other ones, no matter how powerful, how dreadful, how persecuting they are, they will become chaff. We're going to know that. And we're going to have to think that way if we're part of the ones being persecuted. We're going to have to remember that these will come to nothing, no matter how powerful they are at the time. It's a tremendously hopeful message that's wrapped up with these prophecies that get pretty specific about what's going to happen at the time of the end and between Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, and the end. Notice verse 23 of Daniel 7. And thus he said, the fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on the earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms. It shall devour the whole earth and trample it, break it into pieces. And the 10 horns are 10 kings that shall rise from this kingdom. And then notice it says, and another shall rise after them. He shall be different from the first ones and shall subdue 3 kings. And we're talking about some details of history that happened after the fall of the Roman Empire and as the Vandals, the Goths, and all came in, and the Pope and the Catholic Church. We're not going to get into all that today. But notice that he shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. That's exactly what we see that happened many years ago, as the church, the Christian church at Rome, gained power and influence over the empire, as it associated with the Roman Empire and the revivals that came after that, the saints were persecuted. Those who didn't believe as the Roman church dictated were put to death and persecuted. These things have happened historically, and we can read much about that. But it will happen again as Satan uses this tool against God's people at the time of the end. He shall intend to change times and law. Certainly we see that change. Religious holy time is no longer what the Bible says. No longer keep the Sabbath, but Sunday was changed to Sunday. Laws were changed and added, and some ignored. Notice it goes on to say, and the saints shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and a half time. So we read that in correlation with the 42 months as 3.5 years. A 3.5 year period that both Daniel and Revelation speaks of in terms of what we would call the tribulation, a time where this horn, speaking pompous words, changes times and laws and persecutes the people of God. It says in verse 26, but the court... And I just might mention here, again, these are 10 successive kingdoms that are revivals of that original Roman Empire. It says, "But the court shall be seated, and they shall take away his dominion to consume and destroy forever. And the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people and saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him." So again, this message of hope for the people of God who are given to the hand, as if God allows a certain amount of persecution, but they're given. But God allows that. It's something that is part of his purpose. But ultimately, the saints are rewarded for their faithfulness. So again, these 10 kingdoms being spoken of here are successive, happening one after another over the course of a couple thousand years. Now let's go back then to Revelation 13. With these two background prophecies in mind, it helps us understand a little better what we're reading, what John is seeing in his vision in chapter 13 of Revelation. Again, as I said earlier, Revelation 13 is a composite of the empires represented in Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. That fourth beast, that the legs of iron representing the last kingdom, the Roman Empire, and incorporating in Romans 13 as it talks about this empire that will exist at the time of Christ's return. It's incorporating these characteristics of these other empires in this composition or compilation as we see here. Revelation 13, reading again. "I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads, 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name." So certainly not a beast of God. It says, "And the beast which I saw, now the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like the feet of a bear, its mouth like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and authority." So this end-time beast power, this resurrected Roman Empire, is going to have certain qualities of all the others before it. It's a compilation of these things. And Satan guides it. Power comes from Satan. It has great authority that God allows him to have. And verse 3, "And I saw one of the heads as if it were mortally wounded. And this deadly wound was healed. And the world marveled and followed the beast." And of course, this is interesting looking back in history. In 476 AD, the Roman Empire ended. The empire that would be eternal. No one could beat the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire fell for a number of reasons, and it's a story that's been told many times. That mortal wound was struck in 476 AD, but just a few decades later, in 554 AD, was the imperial restoration. Justinian established the Roman Empire, the Roman Empire again. It was healed, came back into fruition, and came back to power. And of course, the succeeding empires that came, that many of them claiming to be a revival of the Roman Empire. We see that happened 9 times thus far, and we're waiting for a 10th empire to come along. But this mortal wound was healed, and the world marveled and followed the beast. And so, verse 4, "And so they worshiped the dragon who gave authority to the beast." Now notice, God is allowing this. He has ultimate authority, but Satan has been given a certain leeway. And it's through Satan's authority that this beast operates. It says they worshiped the beast. They worshiped the dragon and they worshiped the beast. Now perhaps at the end time they're unwittingly worshiping Satan, but that's what they're actually doing. Those who worship the emperor, and we may find that, it seems that we may find that becomes a thing again. It certainly was the case in the Roman Empire. The emperor was an object of worship. We haven't seen that lately in the world, I would say. In World War II, the Japanese worshipped the emperor. So it's not that foreign from the modern world, but that kind of thing could happen again. But in doing so, they're worshiping Satan. It says they worship the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him?" So this tremendous power that we will see as this end time revival, this beast raises up out of the water at the very end of the age that Christ will have to deal with when he returns. These people will think they are doing a good thing. I am fully convinced they will think they're worshiping God. But the prophecy says they're worshiping the devil and the beast. And it certainly is there's an element of idolatry associated with this worship. And I think we see that in the world today, in the religious world, certainly the way the Roman Church developed, the way of looking at the Pope as God's representative on earth. He speaks with God's authority, can change whatever. I'll just give you a couple references here. 2 Corinthians 4, verse 4, talks about Satan blinding the world, whose minds the God of this age has blinded, who do not believe lest the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is in the image of God, should shine upon them. Satan will blind these people in the time of the end to think that they are doing a good thing. And you know the danger? The danger is if we're not aware of these prophecies, if we're not aware of how God sees this beast power, I believe it could be very alluring to even God's people. Perhaps having a message that in some ways we agree with, whatever that final message may be. Perhaps it's a message to return to Christianity because the world has become so corrupt and pagan. And there will be many Christians who like that message, who think that they're following God by supporting it. It's going to be very important for us. I'm fully aware not everybody's a prophecy person. There are those who love prophecy and try to figure everything out and spend much time doing it. Others, prophecy is not such a big thing. I understand that. But at the same time, if we're not aware of some of these things, I think God reveals these things so that we can be strong. We can understand what's happening. We can have the hope of knowing that no matter how bad it gets, no matter how powerful the authorities are, they have nothing on God. And in the end, God rewards his saints. That's going to be a major part of what we need to be thinking about. First Timothy 4, if you turn back to 1 Timothy chapter 4, talks here, Paul has a few things to say in Timothy and Thessalonians about this end time and the deception that will take place. 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 1 says, "Now the Spirit expressly says that in latter times some will depart from the faith." Notice they had the faith. They were part of the faithful. But they depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons. Now, this is important for us to understand that there will be spirit of deception. And believe me, Satan is after God's people. He's already got the world. The spirit of deception. I think we saw that in part back years ago when as many of us lived through the time of deception where so many of the people we sat with at services gave up the Sabbath, gave up the holy days, pursued worldly Christianity. And it was disappointing. We were surprised. How could this happen? It is a spirit of deception. There are spiritual beings involved with trying to lure us away. And that's why it's so important for us to stay strong. I think we sometimes, I don't think I can fully understand how powerful this spirit of deception could be. I don't think any of us can today. But we're going to live through a time where there is a great pull to give up what we believe. In this case, it says, "Some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons." There are many people who are going to think, well, these doctrines may not be exactly what's in the Bible, but they're good. They're fine. At least it's Christian. At least it's nominally Christian. At least we're worshiping Jesus. But Paul calls it doctrines of demons. And so it's important for us to keep in mind that God has given His truth, His way, and there's an entirely different set of doctrines that Paul recognized through the inspiration of God are really from the demonic world. They're against God, but they're going to masquerade as being Christian. There will be, as we know from other prophecies, we'll get more into that next time, but this working together of church and state again. And that was the case throughout much of history. It didn't always work so well, but there was this concept that at various times, was the Pope in charge or was the emperor in charge? At one point, one of the emperors decided he was in charge and found out that he had to come begging the Pope to accept him back. It was a power struggle. The church was more political than religious. And it's a fascinating story as you read through that and consider it. We won't, again, go into all that, those details. But let's go back to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. There is both John in Revelation and Paul in his epistles writes about some prophetic things. Paul mostly talked about doctrine, but he did have some important prophetic things to say about the time of the end. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And beginning verse 1. Now, brethren, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus and our gathering together to him, we ask you not to be soon shaken in mind or troubled, either by spirit or by word or by letter, as if from us, as the day of the Lord of Christ has come. In other words, evidently there were false teachers in Paul's day who were writing letters, evidently, perhaps even from him, seemingly from him, but they were letters of deception. He was saying, don't buy into that, as though the day of the Lord had come, as though the day of Christ had come, as if Christ was coming. And if you listen and read our letters, you'll be able to follow us, because Christ is coming. As we were told in other places, don't believe when they say he's out in the desert. When Christ comes, everyone will know it. It says, let no one be deceived, verse 3, let no one deceive you by any means. Imagine all the ways that God's people will try to deceive us. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day, the day of Christ, will not come unless the falling away comes first. And the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So again, we have this idea that this man of sin is going to come on the scene, preaching against God's laws, God's ways, but he's going to go so far as to take the place of God. Will he be worshipped as God? Well, there's the indication perhaps that's the case. Idolatry. But certainly giving decrees as if he is God, because he's not teaching the Bible or what the Bible says. He's not bringing the same message. He's dictating what's right and wrong. Tremendous presumptuousness that will exist at that time. And again, we have to be careful not to fall for that. Verse 5, Revelation 13. Then let's go back to Revelation 13 and pick up. Verse 5 says, and he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. And he was given authority to continue 42 months. Again, this idea of a 3.5-year period where the beast power, together with as we understand, the false prophet, the man of sin, will have rule and authority and a mixing of church and state. Verse 6, then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. It was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. Now notice the wording there, to make war with the saints and to overcome them. So there will be persecution on the saints. It says, but it was granted to him. God allows a certain persecution to take place. Now, he speaks, I realize God speaks in other places of a safety, a protection. But Satan's going to use this vehicle, this beast power and this false prophet to come after those who are faithful. God allows it. It was granted. I think it's somewhat comforting to keep in mind that what's happening is something that God's granting. He can take away at any time. God's still in control. God has granted it, but it is God who has allowed it. It's not because there's some power that's acting against God and God can't control it. God is ultimately in control. And I think it's important for us to keep that in mind. It was granted to this beast to make war with the saints. It says, an authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. So it's great authority, great world influence that this beast has at that time. And all who dwell on the earth will worship him, whose name has not been written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. So again, this idea of worshiping him, worshiping this beast, and what it represents. How will this take shape? I don't know exactly. How could we go from a world that is so secular, at least in Europe right now, very secular Europe, how can it go from that to a very seemingly religious? Well, obviously, it's a revival that takes place. And oftentimes, difficult times or a common enemy, let's say the Muslim world, as they may see it, draws people together. And there can be a religious zeal that is developed. But keep in mind, this driven by the demonic realm. It's not purely human. We may look at situation in Europe and say, how can the Catholic Church have any influence at the time of the end? They have no influence now, at least seemingly so. They have more than we probably imagine. But how can that happen? Well, keep in mind, as we've read over and over here, there's a spiritual component that can change people's minds very quickly. That, together with circumstances, has oftentimes throughout history led Europeans to do drastic things, unimaginable things. And it's just the history of what we've already seen happen. But again, Satan is behind all this. Finally, verse 9, if anyone has an ear, let him hear. And brethren, that's you and I. We're reading these things. Sometimes it can be a little hard to understand, to keep in order. Hopefully, as we go through, it can be a little clearer as we study it. And I've got a chart that I plan to give next time that for me, if I can visualize it on a chart, it makes it a lot easier. Where does Daniel 7 fit? Where does Daniel 2 fit? Where does that beast, how does it correlate with something else? We'll give out that graphic, and I think it will make it a little easier. But brethren, we are the ones that has ears to hear. We're the ones primarily to whom these prophecies are meant to encourage, to warn us what's going to happen, but that we ultimately do not lose hope. It says, he who leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He who kills with the sword must be killed by the sword. Here is the patience and faith of the saints. We realize that those who may lead some into captivity will ultimately be captive. We realize that those who live by the sword, who kill by the sword, they will be killed by the sword. They will have what's coming to them. And in the meantime, we live in patience, recognizing that we're waiting on God to step in, and in the end, he will. I think we'll end there for now. I'll pick up more next time, especially about the horns and things that we read about. But hopefully we can get a little bit of a grasp there of how we can understand Revelation, particularly Revelation 13, in terms of Daniel 2 and Daniel chapter 7. And then next time we'll pick up. But keep in mind, the most important thing in all of this is what Daniel revealed to Nebuchadnezzar. The kingdom of God is what ultimately wins.